Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back to another episode of our college football rankings. Obviously, after last week, a lot has changed. We're going to have some new teams within the top five. We have a lot of big games going on next week that will preview the biggest of the year so far with Penn State and Ohio State. And with that being said, we're going to start off at the bottom. And in the 25th spot, which it seems like I have a new team every single week, between that 20 and 25 spot, there's been a bunch of new teams. But starting off this week, James Madison takes my 25th spot. They received a good amount of votes in the AP poll. I think they ended up finishing like 26th overall. But this team so far undefeated. They beat up on Coastal Carolina by 40 earlier, or I believe they're yet to play Coastal Carolina. That was last season, but overall undefeated this season so far. And with a lot of teams kind of in that area towards the bottom, I was down to either putting a two-loss team there or an undefeated team. And I just gave James Madison the nod here. Going in through the rest of the season, they have some games like Marshall that they should be able to go through, Coastal Carolina at the end of the year. So they could still be on here by the end of the year. But as of right now, they're in the 25th spot.
Yeah. Now for me at 25, I have Louisville. Obviously, I had them 15 last week. It's a big drop, but it's a really disappointing loss to Pitt. At the end of the day, though, they're still a 6-1 team in the ACC. They've still shown me some really good things, specifically on offense. So they're going to hang out in my rankings pretty far back, though. I have them dropping 10 spots in 25.
And next up in the 24 spot, I have Tulane here. So far, I mean, the story of their season that we've seen is kind of just a tale of two halves between this team. They've played very good in some instances. Some instances, they've it's kept it a little bit close, but overall, this team is pretty good this year so far. Only losing to Ole Miss, so still pretty good. They did have a good chance in that game too, like we saw, but that was kind of the tale of the two halves where they kind of blew up in the second half. But now they're back on the rankings after a win against Memphis. So as of right now, in the 24 spot, still solid.
Yeah, and at 24, I have Iowa. Obviously, haven't been super hot in Iowa since that loss to Penn State, where they looked really bad. And their offense is still one of the ugliest in the country. I mean, they don't do a whole lot of things well on that aspect, but their defense is top five-ish. They're 6-1. And as of now, their only loss is that game against Penn State, who obviously we both have ranked pretty highly. So their defense showed up against Wisconsin as we expected. They held them to less than 7 points. You know, they only put up 15, but still, it was a good game for the Hawkeyes. I'm not as high on them as some people might be. Most people have them around this range, but the offense still has so many question marks. I'm worried about them going forward. For now, though, I have them at 24.
Yeah, and like you just said, I have Iowa here at 23, kind of coming back into the rankings too after that loss to Penn State, but they came back, beat Wisconsin. They're going up against Minnesota this next week. Minnesota, not the best team, but another one of those teams within that Big Ten area that could give them some trouble. So another good test, and if they can get through, another solid win for the resume.
For sure. And at 23, I have Fresno State, a team that I don't see a lot of people putting up here, but they came on top of Utah State in a shootout, and they've been hanging around that 25 spot for a while for me. Their offense has looked explosive at times, and I would say most of the year it's been that way. And I'm a little more confident in them than some of these other teams going forward. They have a pretty easy schedule to end the year as well, but I like what I've seen so far. Malik Sherrod is a really good running back. He's the lead back in their field, and I've really liked what I've seen from him. So Fresno State, I know they took a disappointing L last week, so people might have them lower, but I still like them quite a bit here.
Yeah, and next up, a team taking a embarrassing loss this week is Louisville. Still a good team overall at 6-1 to this point. Still above teams with two losses for me. That big win that they had before kind of keeps them afloat here. I would say a team like this, looking at their schedule, if they didn't have that Notre Dame win with one loss, I don't know exactly where they would be. But as we've seen, Notre Dame is a very good team this year. They just had another marquee win, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So that win kind of keeps them afloat. They're going to have a bye this week, but after that, they're going to take on Duke during the Halloween weekend. So a big game for them, a big game for the ACC overall, too.
For sure. Now, 22, I have Air Force, a new team on both of our lists. As usual, Air Force's rushing attack gets them wins. and they got him a win over Wyoming, a team I know you had ranked 25. A lot of people had ranked last week. So it's pretty impressive bout for Air Force, who I really didn't expect to come out swinging this season. They're 6-0, and with this unique style of offense, maybe their ceiling isn't as high as some of these other teams, but we know it works. We know that with this old school style of offense, they recruit backs that can run, and we've seen their running backs and whoever they line up at quarterback having dominant rushing attacks every week. So I have them ranked. I know the AP does as well. I know you do as well. 6-0 with a win over a Wyoming team that I think is pretty good. It's going to get you a spot.
Yeah. And like you said, I have Air Force next up here for me at the 21 spot. And coming off of a win against Wyoming, who I had ranked at the bottom last week around that 24-25 spot. I forget exactly where they were, but Air Force comes in now. They're undefeated. So a very interesting team to look at for the rest of the season. As we're going to see, a lot of teams are going to start dropping off too at this point. So it'll be interesting to keep an eye on Air Force, because if they win out, they could be in a New Year's Six Bowl for the first time since I think it was World War I. At this point, it's been a very long time since they've been in a game like that. And it's always interesting to look at an Air Force team like this just because they can't have offensive or defensive linemen that we would usually see at other schools. They can't even have players above like 275 pounds. So it's always interesting to see how these teams play, especially with a team that's so run heavy. Usually you need a good line for that to work out. But so far, they've been getting wins. They're going to keep playing some maybe not great competition, but they're going to be able to come out here if they win those games. An interesting team to keep an eye on for the rest of the year.
Yeah, for sure. And a team that we've been talking about a little bit and I've liked for a while now is Tulane, who I have at 21. The Green Wave survived a scary one against Memphis, but I mean, Michael Pratt continues to hold up. And I just like what Tulane has been doing all year, especially on the offensive side. Their defense has some issues. Chris Brazell racked up another big game receiving. I feel like he's had a couple of those now. And towards the end, Tulane's offense was just too good for Memphis to hang around. I had Tulane ranked last week, which was, about a week earlier than most people, but we had them ranked to start the year. They're one of my favorite mid-major teams in all of college football. I think they do a lot of things well. So I think they deserve a spot in my rankings. They bump up 2 spots. And even though the Memphis game was scary at times, I think it showed perseverance from the Green Wave to go out and win that game, especially with a good performance in the second half. So liked what I saw. Obviously a bit sketchy at first, but I think Tulane is legit and they are touching that top 20 pretty soon for me.
Yeah, and starting off with the top 20, I have Mizzou here. Came back last week. They beat up on a pretty good Kentucky team, beat them by 17 points. This week they're going up against South Carolina, who is 2-4, but we know they've been competitive in pretty much every single game they've played this year with Spencer Rattler in that offense. So another game could be a potential trap game for Mizzou. This is one of those games that you keep an eye on. The spread's only 7.5. I expect it to be a close game, but if they can come out and get a big win, they can keep going up and definitely have a good end to their season.
For sure. And I have Mizzou at 20 as well. They owned the fourth quarter of that Kentucky game, which was super huge for them. Kentucky was a team that we've had in and out of our rankings for the last couple of weeks now. So obviously some pretty good competition there. On the defensive side, Abram Drain, he caught a pick, and that really changed the tide of the game, in my opinion. And since that happened, since that moment occurred, it was Missouri all the way from there. That's a huge win. I obviously, when we have 2 teams in conference matching up, and they're both towards the end of our rankings, top 25, that is, that's going to be win and you stay on. And Missouri was the team that did that. I had them ranked 25th last week. I would liked what I saw. Getting a big win over Kentucky bumps them up 5 spots for me. Missouri, like every SEC team we're going to talk about here, they're going to get tested a lot towards the end of the season. And if they roll with the punches and win some games, I mean, that's a ranked, their skill level allows them to be ranked, and they just got to build a resume for it.
Yeah. And another team with a pretty good resume up to this point, LSU, I have here ranked at 19, and coming off of a big win, they smacked Auburn this week. Next week, they're going up against Army. So another big game for Jaden Daniels, Malik Neighbors to go out there, have another big performance. Daniels still definitely within that Heisman conversation at this point. Still up in the air, I would say. We'll talk about a player later, but I mean, he still has a good chance to be able to get in there, at least make it make his way to New York and be one of the top 3 players by the end of the year. This is one of those games against Army where he may not play the whole game, but he should be able to put up a bunch of good stats, 22 touchdowns and 3 picks on the year. He's been great. They've just had a very tough schedule, but they do get kind of back-to-back easier games finally for them.
Yeah, and I have LSU in this spot as well. Throughout their struggles, Jaden Daniels has played good enough to keep them around. Obviously, win some big games down the stretch. And last game specifically, their defense stepped up in big spots. And, it's always nice, even against a team like Auburn, to get a big blowout win over an SEC rival. It looks good on paper as well. And they have looked like the team that we thought they were to start the season more recently. So they're going to jump 2 spots for me. I think if the pieces all click, this is a team that is talented enough to, get a big New York Six bowl game. I mean, it's going to be tough with the record now, but even a team that will fight for a playoff spot, this team is really, really talented. Obviously, when you build yourself a tough schedule, you allow yourself to find, a spot like this where we're halfway through the season and you're not ranked as highly as you want to be. But the team is really good. I can see a big run coming from them. And as you mentioned, Jaden Daniels is going to be in the Heisman conversation probably up until it's time for them to go out to New York to see the rankings at the end.
Yeah. Next up, 18, I have USC here. I still feel like a little bit high. They went up against Notre Dame, a 2-loss team. They got absolutely embarrassed. Caleb Williams had the worst game of his career so far. They just had nothing going for them. The Notre Dame team beat them in pretty much every single aspect. We've seen the downfall of USC. We've talked about it every week, starting off around the top 5 area, 4 or 5, and then falling all the way to 10 without even losing a game. Now they lose. Now they're in the 18 spot. And like I said, I still feel maybe a little high. This team, just like we've said every week, I mean, the defense is going to be the reason why they lose games. And this week, the defense was bad, but Caleb Williams was also bad. So there was no chance they were going to be able to win this game. Notre Dame was still a competitive opponent, and they went out there and they did everything right. USC did everything wrong. And with the way that a team like Washington and Oregon look at this point, I think USC's season, there's no way they make the playoffs at this rate. They could go out there and maybe get a couple of wins for the rest of the season, but they're not as good as Oregon. They're not as good as Washington, no matter how you put it. They may win one of those games, but they're not going to be a playoff team at this point.
Yeah. And this marks another week in my 18 spot where I have Tennessee ranked lower than you. If you guys are new, I'm a Tennessee fan, so it's fun to see. But for me, I mean, they jumped 2 spots, right? So good win against A&M, but seeing Joe Milton continue to struggle is not something that makes me very happy as a fan. But their defense is stepping up in a big way. It's kind of the opposite of what we saw last year with a high-powered offense and a defense that won't show up. I mean, we've seen the complete opposite of that this season. There's just too many turnovers coming from Joe Milton. He was a guy that started the season and started his career at Tennessee with little to no interceptions, and now we get 1 or 2 every week, it feels like. Jalen Wright worked really well on the ground. He's shown up as Tennessee's lead back when it was kind of a question who would be that guy to start the season, obviously with Jabari Small there as well. This win for Tennessee brings them back up towards the top. I mean, obviously the good storyline of this week, outside of that Penn State-Ohio State game, is going to be the Bama-Tennessee game. It's the biggest game in the SEC this week, and those teams are a lot closer in talent than I think a lot of people will want to admit. That game is going to be huge. Tennessee obviously going into Tuscaloosa. So that's going to be the tale of the season for both of these teams. I have Alabama ranked a little bit higher. We'll talk about that more when we get to them. But Tennessee, I mean, tough game against A&M. You win, but you really got to build way more momentum than that if you're going to go into Alabama and expect to win. So looking forward to that game. A little nervous if I can be honest, but Tennessee, still moving up for now.
Yeah, and I have Tennessee at 17. Pretty much everything you said up to this point. They're going to take on Alabama this week. 8.5-point favorite for Alabama. I know you have Tennessee winning outright. Talk about that a little bit later, but I don't know. We'll talk about Alabama and Tennessee a little later. But so far, Tennessee has still bounced back despite the rest of the season. There's been some ups and downs. Only 1 loss, but it still seems like you said, still a little bit of struggle from the quarterback position.
For sure. Now, at 17, a team that's struggling at quarterback for different reasons. I have Duke here. Obviously, Riley Leonard looked like one of the best QBs in the country coming out, but he's injured. And in this game, Duke had to rely on Jordan Waters and the run game as they knocked off North Carolina State pretty easily. I worry about the injury problems, obviously, when your best player is out for a timetable that's kind of uncertain. That's going to be an issue. But this game showed me that even without Leonard, Duke's roster is built to compete, which is something that we didn't discuss at nearly as much as we should have to start the season. This team is really good. Their backup quarterback, Henry Bellin, didn't do too much, but he stepped up when he had to. And this Blue Devils team rolled over North Carolina State, who I don't think is very good, but in conference play, especially when you're fighting through injuries, those games can be kind of scary. Duke did what they had to do. And, with a talented roster, as I mentioned, they should move forward and continue to look solid. They have big games coming up. Again, ACC is really tough this year, so we'll see how they fare. But Leonard, if he can come back sooner than later, will lead this Duke team probably pretty far, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, and like you said, I have Duke at 16 here. A big game, obviously, this week against Florida State. Riley Leonard, right now, day to day, so he could potentially play this week. As of right now, we're not really sure what's going to happen. If he doesn't play, I think Florida State should go out there and win this game if they're really as good as they're supposed to be. But with Riley Leonard, it does make it a little more interesting. Even if Duke does go and lose this game, overall, they've already exceeded a good amount of expectations going into this year. And even if they lose this game against Florida State, if Riley Leonard could come back next week, which it seems like if he doesn't play this week, if he's day to day, he will be back. They said they're pretty optimistic for the rest of the season, and they have a pretty tough schedule towards the end of the season. So even if they can't win this game, they still have some big games later that we'll see with UNC, with Louisville later. So they can still have a good end of this season. And hopefully Riley Leonard comes back soon, maybe this week, make it a good game.
Yeah, I mean, hoping for the best for him. That would be the best for the Blue Devils as well. At 16, I have Utah jumping up 2 spots. I mean, what a game for Sion Vaki of the Utes. I mean, they beat up on Cal as they were supposed to do. And talk about the quarterback position, some uncertainty. I mean, we still don't really know what the deal is with Cam Rising, and they've continued to survive and play well week to week without him. They have some momentum on their side going into this USC game. As you mentioned, USC with the most disappointing loss of the week. They did not look like the team that we had fighting for a playoff spot. So with Utah coming off a good win, I mean, momentum flies high. Obviously, rivalry, emotions fly high. This could be a really, really good game. And I would argue for Utah and USC, this is the breaking point of your season. This is a must-win game if there ever will be one. So I'm really excited for that matchup. I know I'm going to catch some flack for having Utah ranked lower than USC. I'll talk about USC in a minute. I think these teams are very comparable, and it's tough because they play each other this week. But I mean, if I could have a 15 A and B, it would be these guys. I think they're very, very close.
Yeah, and like you said, both of those teams pretty close up to this point. I have Notre Dame here at 15, a 2-loss team. Obviously, they have a big win this week going against USC, but with USC kind of going down every single week, obviously it's a big win. You're going against that team, but having them at 10, I just don't really see the need to push them maybe as high. But I think overall, they're still a very good team to this point. They just haven't played their best football when they needed to. Sometimes they have. It's been a tough schedule this year, but like we've seen, those 2 losses definitely coming back to bite them. Even if they only had 1 loss now, definitely a top 10 team up to this point. But it is kind of tough because at the end of the day, they do have those 2 losses. Sam Hartman obviously had a very bad performance last week. This week goes out and beats USC. So a good game, good bounce back game for him. Overall, it's going to be a tough matchup for the rest of this season for Notre Dame. They've got through a pretty big gauntlet, but they still have some tougher games to the end of the year. It's definitely not a cakewalk to the end of the season. So if they can continue to pile on some wins, I don't think it would be a very outside shot at this point to get to the playoffs, but they could definitely get into a New Year's Six bowl, and Sam Hartman can continue to bring his draft stock up.
For sure. At 15, I have USC. You mentioned them earlier. I'm a little higher than some people, but I have some of the same thoughts, to be fair. They just got dismantled by Notre Dame, a team that, we've been pushing the narrative week after week. We like Notre Dame, but they could be fraudulent. And they absolutely bullied USC, which, was disappointing to watch as, we expected Caleb Williams to go out and perform at the highest level, and he just didn't do so. USC started off the game really bad, so they had to play from behind most of the game. And this is the most classic college football terms ever. If you can't establish the run, your offense can't move. And obviously, USC likes to throw the ball, but when you don't have a running game, it makes life a lot easier for players in that Notre Dame secondary. And they abused Caleb Williams with that. The Trojans disappointed on the big stage. Obviously, as we both mentioned, very disappointing. But they'll have to beat Utah to stay competitive. As I mentioned when I was talking about Utah, that game is going to be really, really huge. If USC can go out and beat the Utes, I mean, that's a ranked win. It bounces them back up a little bit. But as you may have mentioned, the season might be too far gone now because this Notre Dame game was circled on their schedule all year. It was the must-win game, and they lost it. So it's damage control at this point. Try to bring your team back up to fighting for, an important bowl game, possibly a playoff spot. But you're really going to have to do everything right from this point forward. And that's just not what we've seen so far from USC.
Yeah. And like you said before, talking about Utah, I have Utah here at the 14 spot. Overall, so far, this team has looked good. They've looked a little on the edge. Still don't know what's going on with the quarterback situation. They're going against USC this week, and it's going to be an interesting matchup, to say the least. USC at home, 6.5-point favorite. I think they should go out here and win this game. If they can't go out and beat Utah, then their season is pretty much over at this point. I think USC needs to get this win to come and bounce back. Then they'll be back within, maybe close, definitely close to the top 10 at this point. I have them at 18. They beat Utah if they do this week, and then that boosts them back up. I just don't know if they really can compete with these teams for the rest of the season, just because we've seen how good Washington has been. We've seen how good Oregon has been, but we'll see them match up later in the year. Maybe this drives Caleb Williams to come back. And overall, an interesting game going into this week. Utah, I wouldn't say would be better than USC at this point in the season, but after that loss from USC, I think it's kind of tough to put USC over them, but they're going to play this week, so we will see who is better.
Yeah, and that'll obviously be a great game. At 14, I have Ole Miss. It's their bye week. They just get jumped by a couple teams I'll talk about later. But with that being said, looking forward to next week. I expect them to make easy work of Auburn after we saw how Auburn performed last week. Hypothetically, they jump up a couple spots. It's going to be tougher. It's not just on paper. Ole Miss is better. It's SEC play. It's conference play. This stuff can always get weird, but assuming they make the most of that game, play pretty well, they'll be back up. So I wouldn't take the bump down very seriously for Ole Miss here.
Yeah, and next up, I have Oregon State here at 13. So Oregon State has been good this year so far. Overall, this team 6-1, a big win against UCLA. Obviously, UCLA pretty good this year. DJ Ongolalea had a good game. We have seen him be on the ropes for a lot of games. He has had some poor performances, but they went out there, they won that game, and for the rest of this season, it is going to be tough. There are going to be some tough matchups for them. But as we look forward, as of right now, they're going to have next week off. So coming off of that big win, they're going to be able to take some rest and then gear up for the end of the season, where they definitely still could make a push.
Yeah, for sure. And I have them at 13 here. I'm a big fan of Oregon State and what they've been doing. They handled a UCLA team that was ranked. AP by us, and some people still have them ranked. So clearly pretty good competition there. And, I've been hot on them, and them pulling off a big win against UCLA is definitely something that makes me feel a little bit better about that. That's a legit win. As usual, weekly Damian Martinez update, picked up 90 yards on the ground. DJ, as you mentioned, looked pretty solid as well. When the offense rolls, this Oregon State team is really tough to stop. Are they legit contender? Probably not, but are they doing everything that they have to do to earn themselves, a spot towards the top of our rankings? I think so. I think the Beavers take that bye week, use it to not only rest up, but prepare for this tough end of the season that they've built up. And who knows? A big win or two in there, and maybe they are legit contenders, but have to wait and see for most of that.
Yeah. And next up, I have Ole Miss here in the 12 spot. So far, they've been very solid this year. Obviously, that loss to Alabama still hurts them a little bit, but I have them right behind them. Both of these teams very good. That was a pretty good game when we watched both of them play. They're going to go up against Auburn this week on the road. So definitely a tough matchup for Ole Miss. Only a 6.5-point favorite. I feel like that's pretty fair. Going into Auburn, Auburn's maybe not the best team overall. They've lost all their SEC games, but they're still a tough SEC matchup. I want to see a good game from Quinshon Judkins this year. He's had maybe one very good game. I expected a lot more going into this season from one of the best running backs, and hopefully he can go out here and play well against Auburn. Ole Miss continuing to roll and seeing what happens. If you're an Ole Miss fan, this Alabama game is very big because if Tennessee goes out there and gets that win and Ole Miss wins, then I mean they essentially control their destiny for the rest of the season for the SEC championship.
For sure. Now, 12-5 Notre Dame, a little bit higher than most because, they have 2 losses, but getting a win over USC, a team that we've had ranked towards the top all year, is going to get a big boost from me. I mean, they look good too. The defense obviously stepped up. That you can just tell that by looking at the box score. But seeing Estime and Hartman controlling the offensive pace once they got a lead was very convincing to me. The 2 losses is tough, as I mentioned, but if they win out the rest of their schedule, which will be tough, things could fall their way. And I'm not saying that this is a team that's necessarily going to make the playoffs because that's always going to be tough in modern day college football when you have 2 losses already. But when you break it down, I mean, their 2 losses are quality. Depends how you see Louisville for sure, but they have quality wins, quality losses. They haven't played too many fluff or cupcake games. They obviously won't really get any of those going forward. So I like what I've seen. They're going to have to win out to really be in the spot going forward. But as of now, with a big win over debatably the best player in all of college football, I'm going to give them some credit there. So I have them at the 12 spot this week.
Yeah. And going up at my 11 spot this week is Alabama. And they're obviously going up against Tennessee this week. So a very good matchup between these 2 teams. 2 teams with pretty good defenses and quarterbacks that have struggled throughout this season. So it's going to be very interesting to see which one rises to the top in this game. Alabama at home. They're the favorite in this game. And overall, I think this will be a very interesting game to watch, like I said, just because both of these quarterbacks have had their struggles, and it just depends on which one can really get it going in the end. It's going to be a tough matchup for both guys, both top defenses in college football this year, in the SEC in general, and definitely a big game to look out for, especially if you are an Ole Miss fan, because Ole Miss, Alabama, right up there with each other, and if Alabama loses this game, they may be done in the SEC championship race this year, but overall, it is going to be a very good game to watch.
Absolutely. At 11, here's where I have Oregon. The game of the week, Oregon came up short, obviously. Another loss on my record for predicted games, but we'll move on to the next. The offense looked solid as we expected, but I mean, just like pretty much every other defense in college football this year, they couldn't handle Michael Penix Jr. He's another guy that's in that Heisman talk. You'll see our rankings. He's the number 1 guy in the Heisman talk. And pretty much anywhere you look now, especially with Caleb coming out pretty slow last week. With that being said, the Ducks get Washington State and then Utah. Washington State, obviously 2 rough weeks back to back, falling off our rankings, and Utah being in the rankings right now. Both of these teams are quality. So realistically, they win those 2 games, they could move on and be pretty competitive going forward as a 1-loss team. I think we both know this Oregon team is really, really good. They just got bested by the Huskies. So, I mean, credit to Washington. We'll obviously both talk about them a little bit later. But Oregon looked good. I mean, they couldn't pull it off in the end. Tough special teams, miscues at the end as well. So overall, I like what I saw from Oregon, but one team has to win, one team has to lose at this point in the season. That happened to be the Ducks here. So they're still hanging around that top 10 spot for me. I know you have them in that top 10. So no, they're not going to fall too far down for me unless something, pretty bad happens towards the end of their season.
Yeah, and like you said, I have them at my 10 spot here, and a very close game. I think if they lost by a good amount, then we would be looking at them a little bit different. But like we saw, it ended up coming down to that missed field goal at the end. And overall, still a very good team. They're going to be competitive throughout the rest of the season. They're going to go up against USC, Oregon State, Utah, 3 big games to end the season. They're going up against Washington State this week, which has just been a fraudulent team. As we both saw, we had them pretty high, and then the losses the past few weeks has pushed them out. But it still should be a good game for them. It's not going to be an easy opponent with Washington State. They will definitely be able to go out there and put some points up, but Oregon should be able to go out there and win that game. They do have the chances with these games towards the end of the season to come back and potentially try to make their way back up in the Pac-12, maybe get that Pac-12 championship game. It'll be interesting to see how that develops with USC throughout the rest of the season, since they will play them. Oregon State, too, another team that's up there. So a very good game overall from Oregon. Like you said, we'll talk about Washington a little bit later, but they still definitely do have a chance for the rest of this season.
Absolutely. And at 10 is where I have Alabama. Alabama got a scare against Arkansas towards the end, and that feels like every Arkansas game, to be fair. They're definitely a team that likes to show up and make things interesting. But this was probably Jalen Milroe's best statistical game all season, which I know wasn't saying a whole lot. He's definitely had some struggles. Alabama's had some coaching struggles in that department. So just seeing him perform well is nice. Obviously, it was kind of first half, lopsided, but you get the idea. I like what Milroe did. I think he looked good. And hosting Tennessee next week, as I mentioned, both of these teams have looked shaky throughout the season. You mentioned the quarterback play. It's been something that's been a question mark on both sides. And at the end of the day, Alabama does have the better defense. So it's going to rely on Joe Milton to go out and make plays for Tennessee. Is he going to look like Joe Milton we saw in the bowl game last year, or is he going to be Joe Milton that we saw last week against A&M? That's the question mark, and that's what definitely is leaving Tennessee fans pretty scared going into this week. As you mentioned, as you previewed a little earlier, I am going to go Tennessee, though. We saw last year Hendon Hooker step up and have an incredible game against Alabama. Obviously, Hooker, a better quarterback than Milton is or will be, but you get the idea. Tennessee steps up when it matters, and that includes big games against Alabama. Historically, Alabama has owned the Volunteers. It's kind of their thing. But in recent years, we've seen the tide kind of shift the other way. I think Tennessee is going to come out strong. I think Jalen Wright and Jabari Small are a dynamic enough backfield that can give Alabama some problems. And Tennessee receivers are going to have to step up as well. Obviously, McCoy and White have looked good throughout points of the season, not super consistent. And if Tennessee's pass rush, which was supposed to be better than it has been so far this season, in all honesty, if they step up, make things difficult for Milroe, force him into dumb mistakes like he has shown to be prone to at times, I think Tennessee goes on and win this game. So, it's going to be tough. Alabama's the favorite for a reason, but I think Tennessee as the underdogs, that's where they play best. They play up to their competition, despite sometimes playing down to the lower competition. You get the idea. I think Tennessee's going to be fired up. I think they go out and have a really solid performance here, and it's going to be close, but give me the Volunteers head-to-head in this one.
Yeah, and hope, like you said, maybe the tide is changing. Hopefully the tide changes for your predictions for the rest of this season. Definitely a big matchup to look out for. Another team moving up the rankings once again is UNC. This team has looked very good. Drake May has kept this team in some pretty close games throughout the season, but he has come out and he's got it done. They've won these games, and UNC definitely looking to make a push towards the end of this season, with Florida State kind of dropping down a little bit for me, for you personally, overall, with a lot of other teams just looking a little more impressive. It'll be interesting to see how this season ends up going, but UNC continuing to ride.
For sure. At 9, I have Texas. They were 10 last week. They jumped a spot during their bye week after some shakeup, and they need to bounce back from that Oklahoma loss. Obviously, they get rest, they get preparation for the rest of their season. But if they can knock out the rest of the Big 12, then it puts them in a spot where they're in the mix for, a playoff position. They're going to need some things to go their way in front of them, but you get the idea. They just need to win out, and that's, sounds easy. It's obviously going to be a difficult task, but they have the roster to do so. I'm hoping for big things for the rest of the year. I think they have looked really, really good. I hope the one disappointing loss doesn't totally tank their season, but it's college football, so maybe it will. We'll have to wait and see on that, but still got Texas pretty secure in my top 10 for now.
Yeah, and I have them at 8 here. Like you said, throughout the rest of the season, as of right now, no more ranked opponents. We could see one of those teams jump up towards the bottom, but at this point, no ranked opponents for their last 6 games. And they should go out here if they win all these games, like we said before, go out there and play Oklahoma at the end of the season for a chance to make a playoff spot. And for now, you just got to continue on going 1-0 every week, and then obviously take on that championship game towards the end of the season. But still, definitely have a big chance to make the playoffs at this point.
Absolutely. And at 8 is North Carolina. If North Carolina fans watch our videos, they might think I'm being too harsh on them lately. So hopefully this changes the opinions there because Drake May shined against Miami. Miami is such a weird team. It feels like this every year. They are really good. They just find ways to lose games. So with that being said, I was a little nervous for UNC. I mean, yeah, they are ranked much higher, but this is a team that, is really talented that they had to go up against. And Drake May looked amazing in that game. This team is 6-0. They've looked solid throughout the whole season. And right now, the only way they should be looking to move is up. I'm going to give them their credit for not dropping a game up until this point, despite getting some tough matchups along the way. That Duke game upcoming will be the one to watch. Riley Leonard, as you mentioned, should be back by then. You would hope so. So that's going to be an absolutely huge matchup. But based on what I've seen from UNC this year, I'm committed in saying that I think this is one of the best teams in the country, which is a take that I had kind of been shaky in and out of earlier in the season. So shout out to the Tar Heels. They go out and win. I think going forward, they need to ride the momentum that they've built up so far. It's not easy to go 6-0 no matter what your schedule looks like, especially in a tough conference. So really, really liked what I've been seeing from the Tar Heels. So I'm giving them their credit now. Hopefully they prove me right.
Yeah. And speaking of another team going up against Duke, we have Florida State here at 7. I know I'm a little bit lower on them than the AP poll is at this point, but they've had some scary close games. And honestly, they've reminded me of a team like USC up to this point where they have been dropping a little bit each week, but we'll see what happens when they start going up against these tough opponents. Riley Leonard, depending on if he plays this week or not, if he doesn't, the line right now is at 14. Florida State, if they're really as good as they are, should go out there and win the game at home. But if Riley Leonard does play, it'll be interesting to watch because if he goes out there and he isn't 100%, then it still should be easy for Florida State. Guys like Jared Verse should be able to go out there and eat whether Riley Leonard is playing or not. So I'm not as high on them up to this point just because they've had those close games. And I just have seen more impressive wins from teams like Washington, which we saw this week, Penn State, Oklahoma up to this point too. But 7, still obviously a very good spot. And if they win out for the rest of this season, like we'll see with Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, all within my top 5. Not all of them are going to make it. So if they go out there, win out the rest of the season, win the ACC championship, then they definitely have a playoff spot.
For sure. At 7, I have Oklahoma. Obviously, they had a big win against Texas, but they're coming off their bye week right now. They drop a spot, but I mean, they're another team. We've talked about a couple squads that could run the table and play themselves into the playoffs. I think the number one example of that would be Oklahoma. If they go out and win out, they beat Texas in the Big 12 championship game, it's a playoff team. So I'll talk about Florida State next, obviously, but I have still a little more faith in Florida State. It's kind of tough right now. These teams, as I mentioned with some other squads earlier, these two are very comparable. They're both fighting in that same position for me, but Oklahoma just a little bit lower, given the fact that I think they have potential to jump higher than Florida State possibly could.
Yeah, and I have Oklahoma here above Florida State. So I guess just my reasoning here, this team, one of the best offenses so far in college football, thanks to Dillon Gabriel. I think that we have him as the second favorite to win the Heisman right now. And depending on how Washington ends the season, if Oklahoma goes out there, wins out for the rest of the season, it could be very close race between Michael Penix and Dillon Gabriel. And both of them have been absolutely fantastic. This Oklahoma offense is very good, very high powered. And for the rest of this season, if they can continue to win out, hopefully we'll be able to get a rematch of that Texas and Oklahoma game at the end of the year because that'll be very fun to watch again.
Absolutely. At 6, at Florida State, I'll give my reasoning a little bit. I like Syracuse actually quite a bit this season, and they obliterated them. Keon Coleman had an incredible game, and the Orange really just never stood a chance. With that being said, it's tough to move them down a spot, which I did end up doing after they got such a convincing win. But I just like the other teams left a little more ahead of them. Obviously, them in Oklahoma, as I mentioned, very close. I do give Florida State the edge because I had them ranked higher last week, and they just had an amazing game while Oklahoma had a bye week. Right, I'm probably not going to make many switch ups in scenarios like that. Their in-state rivals are going to be the biggest games left on their schedule. Miami, as I mentioned, plays teams tough despite usually falling off towards the end of games. They're talented. And Florida, I mean, Florida has kind of fallen off a cliff a little bit here, but they beat Tennessee, who we have ranked. They have shown flashes of being really, really good. So there's going to be tests for the Seminoles coming down the stretch. With that being said, looking at last week, the Florida State Seminoles are rolling right now on offense and defense. Syracuse had a really good offense, and they got held to almost scoreless, only 3 points on the board. So I think Florida State fans should be happy about the rest of their season. They're trending the right direction. And despite us maybe being a little bit lower than some others are, I can't deny that Florida State has been doing some really good things up till this point.
Yeah. And next up for our top five, we both have the same top five. Starting off with number 5, Penn State. Obviously just completely obliterated UMass this weekend. Next weekend going up against Ohio State, the biggest game of the year up to this point. And we're starting to get to the area where we're going to see Penn State, Ohio State, and Michigan all play each other and kind of see who the best team is and comes out of there. Only one of them can make the Big Ten championship on the east side, so we'll see who represents them. It'll be interesting to see what happens, especially if they all go 1-1 against each other, which I think is a very possible scenario. Penn State going into this week playing at Ohio State. It's not going to be an easy game, and it's going to be really depending on how well they play offensively. They have been very slow in the first half, in the first quarter, but so has Ohio State. Both of these teams, very good defense. Penn State, the best in the nation in pretty much any aspect that you want to look at, from the edge rushers to the secondary to the linebackers. So a very big game this week. And I would say whoever wins this game could make an argument to be the number 1 team, if not easily within the top 3 up to this point. I mean, we have Ohio State at 2, we have Penn State at 5. So depending on how this game goes, I think that team could be the number 1 team in the country, could easily make an argument there. And it's going to be a good one. The thing is with this game, even if Penn State or Ohio State loses, then they still do have a chance to make the Big Ten championship, just because we'll see what happens when both of these teams have to play Michigan. So very interesting to look at for the end of the year, but it should be a great game.
Yeah, and I'd be willing to say whoever wins this game probably will be the number 1 next week, depending obviously on what Georgia and Michigan do. But Penn State as a squad in the 5 spot, they're much deserving of this spot. They came out slow against UMass for, about half a quarter, which is about what you expect when you play against a team like that. But with that being said, I do worry going into the Ohio State game how that offense is going to fare. I mean, we talk about their defense. I'm all in. I think that defense is exceptional. I love Chop Robinson. I love Kalen King. They have playmakers all over the field on that 11. I mean, they look great on that side. It's just when it comes to the offense, are these guys going to step up when it matters? Drew Aller is a really good quarterback, don't get me wrong, but he hasn't had games where he's had to prove himself. The whiteout game at home is cool, and the Iowa defense was supposed to be solid, but he didn't even necessarily have the best individual performance that game. We haven't really seen him step up on the big stage. I think he could. I think he has the ability to. That's why this game is going to be so very interesting. And I do think Penn State has a chance to go in and beat Ohio State on the road. But we have yet to see anything that makes me feel surefire about that. So this game is going to be very interesting. I have my vices with Ohio State too that I'll mention. I don't really know how this game is going to go necessarily. If Penn State can start off fast, which we haven't seen them do so far, then they're going to take control of this game and the defense will hold up. I have no doubt about that. It's just, can they do that? And we're yet to see it. So Penn State in the 5, if they go out and beat Ohio State, there's definitely going to be murmurs to put them in the number 1 spot. So very interesting. I think clearly the game of the week. So very excited to see what's going to happen there. And at the end of the day, I mean, we can only predict so much. It's just going to be about how the teams play football come next Saturday. So definitely a game to look out for. If you're not watching it, I don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, and with Georgia being off this week, very interesting to see how that'll play out with the number 1 team. Washington here at the 4 spot, a big game against Oregon. As you guys have known from the start of the season, I've been talking about Michael Penix winning the Heisman. At one point, he was around that 10 to 15 area, and he's been creeping up every single week. Now, I would say no matter where you look, the favorite, just because of the way Caleb Williams played the past 2 weeks. And this Washington team is very legit. We're looking at a team that could make the playoffs for the first time since, I believe, 2014, maybe. It's been a very long time since they even made the playoffs. And for the rest of this season, they're going to have some tough matchups. But if Michael Penix can continue to play the way that we have seen him every single week play, go out there, put 100, 200, 300, 400 yards up, whatever it is, get a few touchdowns on the air, on the ground, he's going to be able to go out there and lead this team as far as they want to go. It just depends on how good they play. This offense, one of the best in the country, and they're going to continue to prove that every single week.
Yeah, for sure. And I have them in the 4th spot too. As you mentioned, we got the same top 5 here. But I think we talk about Oklahoma as the best offense in the country. I'd give it to Washington, especially after that Oregon game. Oregon's defense is no joke. They have a lot of good players on that squad. And Michael Penix just made it look easy. I mean, Rome Odunze is an amazing receiver. They have plenty of other weapons on that offense. And we could spend all day listing them. I think this team is incredibly legit now. I mean, I predicted them to lose, but we both know it's one of the best teams in the country. So them going out and getting a win is definitely a big check mark on their resume up till this point. Gonna have big games going forward, obviously. But as of now, I mean, we're looking at a team with an impressive win over an Oregon team I really liked. They're undefeated, and they have an offense that, as I mentioned, I think is the best in the country. I mean, it's going to be really tough for me not to put them in the top 4 with all those factors in mind. So obviously there's going to be some shakeup. If Penn State goes out and beats Ohio State, they could get jumped here. We'll have to wait and see. But I really like Washington, and that game was the X factor in my decision making for them. I mean, that obviously was absolutely huge. And Michael Penix is playing like the best quarterback in college football, which is something that I don't think either of us really expected. I mean, I know you did, but not a lot of people expected that going into this season.
Yeah, next up, Michigan here at the 3 spot. Statistically, the second best defense in the country up to this point. JJ McCarthy, a very good quarterback up to this point. I know he's been sneaking into the first round of mock drafts and kind of towards that first or second round area to this point. And it makes sense if they can continue to play well for the rest of the season. He will be one of those guys that will definitely be up there for one of the top quarterbacks drafted in the draft this year. And I think this team very solid so far. Still waiting to see them really get a big test. We'll see that with Ohio State and Penn State later. But for now, they're going to continue to kind of stay in this area. They're going to benefit from the next few weeks for not really having to do much, especially with Penn State and Ohio State playing against each other. So they're going to try to continue to keep building up that offense, keep building up that defense until they start playing these games. But for now, they're going to stick here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't really have a ton of notes on Michigan. We know what they are. We know they're a really good team, but they just don't really have the resume for them to be, in my opinion, the best or second best team in the country. Just haven't seen it yet. We will see it soon. Every week, I look forward to being closer to seeing Michigan get big games because I feel like we talk a lot of crap about Michigan sometimes, but they are really, really good. We know this. I want to see them play big games, and if they go out and win, it's going to shut the critics up pretty quickly. So not a lot to say about them going forward. Very excited, but they're going to stick in that 3 spot for me.
Yeah. Next up, Ohio State here at 2. Like we talked about before, a big matchup this week against Penn State. Whoever wins this game, especially if it's Ohio State, definitely be able to jump up into that number 1 spot. Both of these teams very good. It's just going to come down to quarterback play on both sides. Both of these defenses very good. I do give the defensive edge to Penn State at this point, but the offensive edge to Ohio State at this point. So it's just going to be depending on how these teams play, especially with turnovers. Both of these teams really just going to wait for the other team to make a mistake, and whoever can capitalize on those will go out and win this game.
Yeah, and one thing I want to talk about this matchup is it's going to be a really interesting coaching matchup between Day and Franklin. I mean, say what you will, I would argue these are 2 of the best coaches in the country. They know what they're doing. They get their guys prepared, and I really don't think we're going to see either of these teams come out flat. It might be more of a defensive battle, as you mentioned, and I've mentioned as well. Penn State has a really good defense. I think Ohio State's defense is really good as well. So we could see it trend that way. I think no matter how the game script goes, how necessarily high scoring it is, we're going to get good football regardless, whether it's an offensive or defensive battle. Ohio State, really, really solid. They're obviously in our 2 spot. Some people have them ranked as low as 5 or 6. I don't think that makes any sense to me. Just looking at them last week, they absolutely killed Purdue, a Purdue team that, isn't great, but still looking at the numbers on that, Ohio State handled business in every facet of the game. So with that on their back, I mean, they get a blowout. Penn State gets a blowout. They both put up a ton of points, and now they play each other in Ohio State. It's going to be a really, really good game, as I've said a million times now. So obviously going to be looking forward to that. And if Ohio State wins that game with Georgia on the bye week, I'm not going to say this is necessarily the truth because you never know, but that's probably a number 1 team in most people's books at that point.
Yeah, and speaking of the number 1 team right now, Georgia, they got the win last week. Brock Bowers, kind of the big news coming out. He's going to be out for 4 to 6 weeks after he's getting surgery this week. So a big blow to that offense. Hopefully he can come back and be fine, especially going into the draft. Like I've said pretty much every week, the best player in college football right now, the most dynamic at this point. And hopefully he can come back. This Georgia team will probably be on the edge of not being the number 1 team ranked next week, especially if Ohio State wins. I think if Penn State wins, it might be a little more interesting just because they're ranked 7 right now for the AP. So it'll be interesting to see where they would put them beating Ohio State. I think if it was a Michigan game with the AP loving Michigan, then they would probably give them the number 1 spot. But it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Georgia with a bye week. They're going to play some tougher opponents towards the end of the season. So nothing really to worry about for them up to this point. But for now, with the bye week this week, they'll see where they end up next week.
Yeah, and Georgia's going to stick at number 1 for me too. I thought about moving them down after a really impressive game from Ohio State. And honestly, for Georgia, I have my worries here. I mean, with Brock Bowers being out, the best player on that team by a mile, as you mentioned, probably the best player in college football, if not the most skillful, however you want to look at that. But with that being said, this Vanderbilt team that they played against is really, really bad. Like, I'm not just saying this so I can go against Georgia and say that they're not this high power team, because Georgia still is amazing. I mean, they're still my number 1 team, but letting up any sort of points to Vandy is very disappointing. Last year, this might have been acceptable because they were streaky good. Vandy is just really bad right now. So seeing Georgia not play at their best against Vanderbilt was a little bit disappointing. But at the end of the day, we knew the Bulldogs were going to come out on top of that game. They won. And even with Brock Bowers off the field, they found ways to create on offense. When they play against better teams, I have my worries about that, but we're not at that point yet. I'm not going to knock them for getting a win against an SEC rival, right? They did what they had to do there, but with Ohio State and Penn State's matchup, we'll say it a million times, we'll say it again. They're on the edge, they're on the hot seat there. So regardless, it's a bye week. Nothing they can do except for prepare and try to get Brock Bowers healthy as soon as possible. But there's definitely going to be some shakeup in Athens. I know some people are going to be worried about it. They just got to handle business, keep going, and they're going to stick at number 1 for me until I see a dominant performance from someone below them.
Yeah. With that being said, like we said, there's going to be a lot of change going into our top 10, top 5, even maybe the top position this week. We're going to see a big matchup between Penn State and Ohio State. Definitely a big game to watch out for, the biggest up to this point. So with that being said, we'll see you guys next week with our new rankings.
See you guys.